The Queen's Jewish Link presents the Jewish Living Podcast, the show that examines the many facets of Orthodox Jewish life. Here's your host, Izzo Zwirin.
So far, amidst this pandemic, we have covered how it's affecting education, how it's affecting food production, and the differences between how it's affected American and Israeli communities. This week, we are looking at its effects on halacha, and not just the current effects we have seen, such as minyan and shiva, but what long-lasting effects this may have on halachos after we come out of the pandemic. Now, there are many Rabbanim who have been thinking about these shilas, and of course, you may want to consult your own posik for a particular shilah you may have. But we thought we'd ask someone whose job it is to think about these effects.
Hi, I'm Rabbi Mark Dratch. I am the Executive Vice President of the Rabbinical Council of America.
Rabbi Dratch and I will be diving into a number of halachic areas, including the aforementioned minyan, how we deal with missing laning for a number of weeks, and yes, the future of kitniot. I do acknowledge that many of these probably deserve a lot more discussion than we are allotting them for now, but this should just give you a taste of what is to come once COVID has passed. One more thing before we begin. We were having some technical difficulty with this episode, and as a result, some of the audio is a little distorted, and we do apologize for that, but the information is there and certainly valuable. Rabbi Dratch, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a very hectic time in the world, but I appreciate you taking the time out to join us and talk about some of the prevailing issues in halacha that the coronavirus has faced with us.
Thank you for your invitation. I'm excited to speak with you.
All right, so I'm just going to jump right into it. We're going to go through a couple of different areas of halacha and how the coronavirus has affected us and where we are moving forward. So I want to start with the day-to-day aspect. Obviously, people aren't davening with a minyan. People aren't able to say Kaddish necessarily. People aren't having shiva houses. People are having issues with weddings and brises and all sorts of different ritualistic things. So I was wondering, where do you stand? Do you see that the biggest issue of day-to-day changes are in our society right now?
Sure. Thank you very much. I just want to make one comment before we begin. And that is, in our conversation today, I'm not speaking on behalf of the RCA, the Rabbinical Council, and any question that a person has really should be discussed with his or her own rabbi for a final determination. But I'm happy to speak with you about the experiences that I've had in dealing with the rabbis of the RCA, in conversations with Rabbi Herschel Schachter and Rabbi Mordechai Willig and other poskim with whom we have shared many of these questions. Look, we're in a very, very difficult time. There's a sakana, there's a real danger out there. We're at a time of a not just an epidemic, but a pandemic. People's lives are at stake. And therefore, the halachic principle that of pikuach nefesh, that saving a life and life in general is one of the highest principles of Judaism. And almost any mitzvah in the Torah, except for three major prohibitions, is pushed aside in the face of a threat to life, and therefore everything that we say has to be taken with that kind of understanding. The Gemara says that that danger is more important and overrides ritual prohibition in most cases. Now, certainly, you have to be an expert in halacha to know how to apply that and what that means. But these are the things which are guiding us. So, for example, when it comes to the question of minyan, and it's really very encouraging in many ways that people have this great desire to want to daven with a minyan and to want to go to shul and be with others. But certainly that desire to daven in a minyan, to say Kaddish, to hear repetition of the Shemona Esrei, Kaddish and Baruch Hu and other things pale in comparison to a threat to life. And therefore, it seems to me and to the poskim that I've cited before, that it is prohibited. It's usher. It's actually prohibited today to go out of your way and look for a minyan. Certainly when 10 people are in the same room, but even if people are going to be observing social distancing outside, such a thing would be prohibited because for two reasons. One is that people aren't always careful. And I've had reports of people davening 6 feet apart from each other, and then after the minyan is over, gathering together and socializing, which really undoes the whole thing. And even there have been reports of people with balconies in apartment complexes that could see each other from distances, davening with a minyan, each person on their own porch. And even something like that would be prohibited. a minyan requires 10 men in the same room. Once you have that, others may be able to be counted if they're in the other room, on the other side of the door, or elsewhere, or even, according to many opinions, if they hook in through the internet, through Zoom or something, to be able to answer and or to be considered as davening tefillah b'tzibur, as the prayer is part of the community, but they can't be counted as part of the original part of the community. They can't constitute the initial minyan.
So let's say you have an apartment building in let's make it easy in Eretz Yisrael, apartment building, and in one of the apartments there's a family that has 10 men who live there, and over the age of bar mitzvah, they can technically, I guess, go out on their porch, make their own minyan. They're quarantined or they're social isolated together already, and then other people around that complex can probably partake in that minyan.
Right, if that were the case. If you had a house in which people were in the house and permitted to be there with each other and living with each other, and you have a minyan, they can certainly have their own minyan. Somebody else who sees them, or even from a distance, or would hook in through Zoom or Skype or something else, certainly participate in that minyan. The person who's zooming in would not be able to say Kaddish on his own end because people are not there to respond, but they could certainly respond appropriately to Kaddish and Kedusha.
And I guess the same thing would be true if they happen to have like a microphone with amps and broadcasting it out to a courtyard.
Yeah, I would imagine so.
Okay.
I would imagine so.
All right. I'm going to jump a little bit because I'll get to Pesach a little bit later. A lot of shuls are doing a Zoom type minyan, and the way that you described it right now, where people are logging in and davening kind of together but kind of separate. So firstly, if there's a shul in a different time zone that does that, and I log in, and for me it's chakras, and for them it's mincha, is that okay? Is that any different than just me logging into a chakras minyan? How does that work?
Yeah, I don't think there's any problem with that per se. The people who are Skyping in are not constituting a minyan, and in many ways, the benefit of that is for people to feel connected, to join their tefillot together. Look, I'm not sitting in Shemayim with a checklist and who's with a minyan, not a minyan, or something. But if it increases a person's kavana, a person's intent to spirituality, a feeling of connectedness to others, then I think there's certainly value in that.
We're now in a situation of an extreme case. This has obviously never happened before, and hopefully will never happen again. But I'm curious about how something like this could affect future halachic ramifications. So you mentioned that shuls are not permitted to be open per se. Right now, people can't go daven with their regularly scheduled minyanim, but there are places that have these Zoom or Skype minyanim that are going on. I'm curious about in the future, you have a case where, let's say there's an individual who unfortunately has cancer, and they can't go to shul for fear of being infected. They're going through treatments, their immune system is down. So the shul decides that instead of sending a lot of 9 other people to his house to make a minyan, they say maybe it's better for you to be socially distanced, and we're going to have a portal open for you to zoom into our minyan. Is that something that you could see cropping up further down the road?
Sure. First, I want to one caveat before answering the question, and that is one of the concerns that rabbis have is because we're bending over backwards to find accommodations, and in many cases relying on shat halachic, emergency, the exigencies of the emergency situation to rely upon leniencies that are now becoming widespread and people are knowing about them, that we want to make sure that that when things return to normal in the world, that halacha returns to normal as well. Right. And we understand that there's such a thing as lechatchila, an ideal way of observing the law, the eved, an ex post facto way, and the shat halachic, an emergency way. And that the shat halachic, that the emergency doesn't become the lechatchila, doesn't become the ideal. That being said, even before the coronavirus appeared, there were tshuvot from very significant posting talking about these virtual minyanim and having people participate in that way. And I think that this is something good that may be able to come out of this, that we understand the importance of connectedness, and that if there's a regular minyan in the shul and a person can't go, that maybe this is a way of including that person in tefillah b'tzibur. I think one of the fears that we actually discussed this long before Corona, and one of the fears that we had of making it popular is that this may then become an excuse for people not to go to shul and not to go to minyan, who otherwise should. So I think we have to know that it's there is a wonderful thing, and we have to be careful how it is applied. I'll just give you an interesting comment. A friend of mine, I have a friend now in his 60s, born with cerebral palsy, who the last short while has been unable to walk. Even as he walked difficultly before, he's really homebound now. And for him, he said that the past couple of weeks, with all the lectures online, the shiurim online, the programs online, has really opened up a world to him that had previously been closed. And he's really enjoying that kind of access. And I think that if we're going to become sensitive to the needs of individuals, this may be a good lesson for us.
Yeah, I do think that we're going to see a lot more of those types of shiurim happening. I think you'll end up seeing a lot of shiurim that go on a regular basis that happen in a shul, in a school, will also be able to be broadcast online. For instance, people who work late aren't able to go, but if you're broadcasting it, maybe they can catch it on their commute home. Now that we all have these devices that allow us to do this. So you plug in your headphones, you sit on the train and you watch a shiur that you're not otherwise able to go to. It's not just, in that case, I feel like it's not just for cholim, it's for everybody that just can't make it to a shiur. But you're right, in terms of how this is going to affect halachic ramifications in the future, we have to make sure that it stays as just an extraordinary circumstance and not the norm. My fear when I brought up the example of a chola that can't go to shul, if the shul opens up a minyan portal, where do you draw the line? Okay, somebody's on vacation and they're in some remote location without a minyan. Are they allowed to? Someone who's on a business trip, it's not, I didn't choose to go on the trip, I was forced to. So it's kind of that, where do you draw that line? And I think that's something that the rabbinic authorities are going to have to grapple with after this whole situation finishes.
Sure, most certainly. I'll just say my personal experience at the RCA is we now have our executive committee meetings on Zoom. And it's a wonderful thing because it enables people in California and in Toronto and in South Florida and in Texas to be part of our executive committee and to participate. Problem is, once we open that up, person who lives, our office is 27th and 7th in Manhattan. I have people on the east side and the west side of Manhattan who are no longer coming into the office for a meeting. They're zooming in as well. And as a result, you lose the face-to-face. You lose that the social capital that is built up when people can sit and talk to each other and get to know each other in a personal way.
So it's funny because I think that the world in general is moving that direction with the social networking aspect of it. And now it's not just the RCA, obviously. It's all businesses are all of my meetings for work are happening on a Zoom call or on GoToMeeting. They're all happening that way. And people are like, oh, we can just do this all the time. But that's not true. You can't do it all the time. I've had this discussion with a number of people. You can't, yes, on occasion you can have these types of meetings when it's needed, when people are unable to get together, but you do lose a lot by not having people there. My shul, which is actually our shul, we had our board meeting last night. More people showed up to that board meeting on a Zoom call than have shown up to a regularly scheduled board meeting in years, maybe.
Right.
So yeah, that is something that is happening. Before we go to Pesach, is there any other areas that you want to cover on the regular basis?
Right. So I just wanted to assure people who are listening and may have concerns about Kaddish, because one of the calls and emails that I think rabbis are getting all the time is, I have a yard site or in the 12 months for my parent or something, and what do we do about Kaddish, and making arrangements for other people to say Kaddish when there were other minyanim that were going on. I mean, I had that experience as well. The first Shabbos that our shul was closed a couple of weeks ago was the yard site for my wife. It was her 7th yard site. Then we weren't able to say Kaddish. But Kaddish is not a magic formula. And the idea really is to show respect and to give respect to the person's neshama, to the person's soul, to the person who is deceased. And anything that is done in memory of that person also has a benefit. So one can learn, if one is able to learn Mishnah, if one is able to do some kind of act of kindness. My late wife's aunt passed away. Her first yard site was just last week. And so in addition to learning in her memory, We had the family on our WhatsApp group post pictures of her. There are dozens and dozens of pictures of her with nieces and nephews and great nieces and great nephews, a way of commemorating her. And I think that we need to refocus our understanding of what significant expressions, religious expressions and spiritual expressions are, and they're very valuable. I can't imagine a God up in heaven who's saying that somehow my loved one's soul will not, receive some kind of benefit because I didn't go to shul because of the corona epidemic.
Yeah, I actually recently called into a virtual shloshim. No Kaddish, but they made the whole siyum. Everything else was there, and yeah, it's very difficult. Also, a lot of that. Additionally, with there are people passing away, unfortunately, not only from coronavirus but from other causes, and the shiva is very different now. You don't have that community coming together to help assist with that. A few episodes ago, maybe the last normal episode I did was actually with a non-Jewish person named Jeff, who works in an entirely from environment, or mostly from environment. He was telling us about what he's experienced, what he's seen about our community from the outside. And he said one of the nice things that when people go through something in our community, everybody comes together. He doesn't see that in other communities that he's a part of, where we all band together, we all get around and in support. And those people that are unfortunately sitting shiva these days don't have that. So it's another aspect of the community that we're losing with this whole situation. So I want to move on to Pesach. Now, I'm sure you're aware maybe a week ago before recording, or 2 weeks ago, there was a big psak that came down from a bunch of Sephardi poskim, I think mostly in Northern Africa area, but also elsewhere, about having a Zoom seder. Now, I also know that well before that, you sent out, and I'm getting it on my phone right now, a letter from Rav Schechter, where he explains when something like that is permitted and when something like that is prohibited. So I want to give you the opportunity to talk about those two things, both the psak from Rav Schechter, the psak from the Sephardic community, and where they differ.
Sure. So, with regard to that psak from those Sephardic rabbis, 3 of whom retracted within 24 hours of it being publicized, saying that it was misrepresented and they had never agreed to it in the first place, that is not something which is accepted by the overwhelming majority of rabbinic leaders. The use of technology on Shabbos or on Yom Tov is a very complicated issue. From the time that electricity was first discovered, and light bulbs and other kinds of things, it's an amazing treasure of halachic material and rabbinic response written to those types of things. And there are many different opinions as to what the issues, what the prohibitions might be, what is permitted, what is prohibited with regard to that. But there is almost universal consensus that initiating electronics on Shabbos or Yom Tov is problematic, and making use of something like Zoom because of the camera that's involved, or because of the human interaction involved with that may be problematic as well. So, except I know of no rabbis, even many in the Sephardic community with whom I've had conversations, that support that blanket heter, that blanket permission that was given. When I spoke with Rav Schechter about this originally, the question was about something else. And that is the question of sakana, of danger, the question of pikuach nefesh, of saving a life. And we know, especially this year, it's a 3-day Yom Tov. The first seder is Wednesday night, you have all day Thursday, all day Friday, all day Shabbos. For a person to be alone for 72 hours, who is otherwise vulnerable because of psychiatric issues that they may have, there may be a real question of pikuach nefesh, or preventing something dangerous from happening. Loneliness can sometimes have a very important, very significant impact on a person's emotional well-being, and therefore on his or her physical well-being as well. And therefore, Rav Schechter said, in limited circumstances, where a rabbi, along with the mental health professional, along with a physician, along with the person involved, feels that it is absolutely necessary in order to protect the person's physical well-being or mental well-being, that we could permit something like a telephone call or Skype, perhaps. Rav Shechter was a little bit more lenient if an elderly person is alone for that time, having no human interaction whatsoever, that maybe leaving the radio on or a television on in a separate room, and not being adjusted and nothing being changed on it might be an answer for somebody for whom loneliness may be overwhelming. The truth is that for most people who live in some kind of community, people, their neighbors or family that live near them should be aware of it and should go over on Shabbos or Yom Tov and knock on the door and speak to them from outside of the window, or stand at a distance so the person is not alone for that long a period of time. For a seder, it may be more difficult. I spoke to an 85-year-old woman who lamented to me this is the first time in her entire life she'll be alone for a seder. So everything needs to be understood and taken really on a case-by-case individual basis. Many are making suggestions that families get together on Skype or Zoom in the afternoon before the seder and let the grandparents hear their grandchildren sing Manish Tana and sing Dayenu and Echad Miyodeh or whatever else it may be. There are ways to create those kinds of connections, albeit not at the actual seder. So what I'm suggesting is that the blanket heter that was given has been rejected by 99.9% of the rabbinic world, and I think rightfully so. I think by permitting it and allowing that, we would be changing the whole nature of what Shabbos and Yom Tov is in our community in a way that, Baruch Hashem, I mean, it's our kids and many of our adults are slaves to their devices all week long. Thank God we have a Shabbos which doesn't allow us to do that. So to change that, would be, I think, very, very dangerous and would not be according to the halacha. But if a person feels that there is real vulnerability there, that they should speak with their rabbi, speak with mental health professionals, and we can find ways to make sure that everybody feels connected to and feels safe.
That comment you made about it's thank God we have a Shabbos that we can disconnect. That was another thing that Jeff brought up when he looked at our community. Is like we don't have that. Like right. If somebody says you're going to disconnect for a day for 25 hours, like people look at you like you have seven eyes. Like why would you do that? But the fact that everybody in the community does it's not weird. The other thing that I've been discussing with my wife, for one, but a lot of other people as well, is that we have a kind of a unique opportunity this year for those of us with children, especially with little kids, where you can have them at a seder, you can teach them, you can really do Higarat Levincha on the night of the seder as maybe initially intended. The kids had little, or at least much less instruction from school this year as to what's going on in Pesach. The Sedarim are going to start much earlier, especially the first night. You can start at, how long does it take to daven Ma'ariv by yourself? Already, there's no going to shul and coming back from shul. You can really start the Seder pretty early, and you don't have to necessarily fly through it in order to get to the meal right away. You can actually have a little bit of time in order to talk to your kids. So I was wondering if there's any advice for people who are maybe doing their own Seder for the first time, maybe not doing leading a Seder for the first time, but leading it with this few people for the first time, and what we should really be talking about.
Oh, sure. Thank you. First of all, in terms of the time for starting the Seder, it has to be done after nightfall, after the time that Shabbos would have ended. So you can start it, so you can have everything prepared, but starting before that is problematic. If you have little kids who may not stay up, you could start a little bit earlier and just sing some of the songs and do some of the things, but you can't make kiddush before nightfall. Right. So be careful about that. But the truth is, I think what you're saying is really what the obligation of the Seder is all of the time. And that is that you have to speak. It always struck me as funny. You would, one of the things we're going to miss this year is walking into shul the first morning of Pesach, the night after the first Seder, and the competition. How long was your Seder? We were up till 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. It's a competition.
It's funny because it's a competition both ways. It's we finished by 10:30. There's two different competitions that go on depending on who you're talking to. Right.
But the truth is that the Seder, the best length of the Seder is the length that is appropriate for the people that are sitting around the table. Right. So that if you have when we say Kol Hamarbeh Reza Meshubach, the more you elaborate, the more praiseworthy it is. That has to do with the songs of praise to God and telling the story as a way of thanking God for the miracles. But the mitzvah of Vigarat Levincha, of telling your child, we don't say Kol Hamar. If you have a child with a 1.5 minute attention span, that's all that you have. You have a child who's more interested, so you have more time. The Chai Adam points out that when you sit around the table, you should read the Haggadah in the language people understand. So if nobody understands Hebrew, then the story should be told in English or whatever language the people around the table understand. It has to be appropriate for the people that are there. So if you have a nuclear family of parents and young children, so it's going to be a very different kind of seder. It should be a very different kind of seder than just some adults sitting around the table by themselves, or parents with older children. Look, the Haggadah tells us that there's a Tam and there's a Rasha and an Enedei Alishal and a Chacham, and each one has to get the answer that's appropriate for them. I've suggested for many, many years that if all a person does is read the text of the Haggadah at the Seder, so they fulfill the obligation of singing God's praises. But they don't feel the obligation of telling their children because there's no script. The parent has to know his or her child and what's appropriate for them that particular year, that particular night. And it may be that we speak to our 5-year-old, and then we turn and we speak to our 10-year-old, and then we have a conversation with our 15-year-old, because each one of them has to hear a different story.
I will throw in a little piece of advice for those of us out there doing our own Sederim for the first time with no extended family. Usually, if you have a situation where you're switching off every year, going to this family, going to that family, you just do whatever that family says. Have the discussion now with which minhagim you're adopting. Usually, whatever side you want to take it from, but have that discussion now. My wife and I discussed which nigunim we're going to be using for nirtza. So don't wait until the Seder night to have that conversation. You can have that now and be prepared for those types of things.
Right. So 2 things. Number one is you can sing Nirtza twice, so it's not a problem. And everybody can be happy. And secondly, a very wonderful idea of a way of including and feeling included in somebody else with Seder at the Seder. And that is to have the kids or the write letters or Divrei Torah to their grandparents, or grandparents doing that for their kids and say, don't open this envelope until you get to, I don't know, the frogs, the plagues. And then at that moment, open it up and read what that person had to share. So it creates a sense of connectedness and a sense of belonging and a sense of presence at a time when you wouldn't otherwise have had it.
I like that a lot. Any other tips for Sederim?
I don't know. I could go on and on.
We would need a separate podcast for that.
I think so.
Okay.
All
right. So one question that's been going around has been a call for a heter on kitniot. And I was wondering if that's been tossed around in the RCA just because of a potential food shortage. I don't see that happening for the first days. We had on last week one of the vice presidents of Kedem, or I remember what his exact title was, but Jay Buxbaum from Kedem, and he was explaining what they are doing in order to help prevent a potential food shortage. But should there be one, let's say during Chol Hamoed, you turn around and there's just not enough food available, is that something that's being discussed as a possible alternative?
So we've had conversations. The question has been posed. We've been assured by all the suppliers of kosher food, that the kosher Pesach food, that there will be no shortages. Certainly in the bigger cities, the bigger communities, we can almost guarantee that. If somebody's in a much smaller town where it's very difficult to get supplies, it may be a little bit harder. At the moment, none of the poskim feel that there's the crisis has reached a point where we need to permit kitniot. If a person really does not have supplies and can't get supplies and can't be satisfied with, I don't know, potatoes and everything else, that look, if you go back to the time of our grandparents or great grandparents, they had maybe 1/10 or 1/20 of the kinds of kosher Pesach foods that we have, and they managed. And they did, and they did very well. So, kitniot for Ashkenazim is a very strong and very important minhag. People challenge it and question it for all kinds of reasons, but there doesn't seem to be any indication at this moment that it's something that we have to permit.
I think a lot of people who are listening to that answer are both very understanding and very disappointed.
Okay.
Moving forward, we already spoke about the potential ramifications about minyanim. I want to talk about the potential ramifications of sphira moving forward. So right after Pesach, we have Sfira, or during Pesach, but the strict halachas of Sfira start after Pesach. One of the I'll talk about two areas of that. One of the areas that parents are using, one of the tools that parents are using to keep their kids engaged throughout this time are putting on concerts for their children. I've seen Yaakov Shweki, Morty Shapiro. A lot of people have done a bunch of live concerts from their houses. Parents are putting on recorded concerts that are available online that artists have made available. Do you think that is something that we can continue to do throughout Sfira this year?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. Yeah, I don't think it's the problem. Rabbi Soloveitchik was of the opinion that the prohibition of music, or the prohibitions of Sfira in general, are like the prohibitions that a person has for a parent during the 12 months of mourning. But the prohibition is simchas mereus. It's public celebration. So the Rav would allow a person in private to listen to music because there's no prohibition of music per se, but it's the public nature of it. So certainly for a child who needs to be otherwise entertained, there's not a problem whatsoever. But I would argue for anybody, if it's difficult and they need a distraction, and it's done in privacy because that's the definition of being in quarantine or self-isolating, that there wouldn't be a problem with that. The other interesting question that was posed with regard to haircuts.
I was going to get to that next.
Yes. So there's not a problem. There's not a problem either, based on the Rav's position that it's like the 12 months. So when it comes to the 12 months of mourning for a parent, once your friends tell you look really disgusting, you need a haircut, you're permitted to do so. Certainly by the time the barbershops and the salons are open again, everybody needs and can get a haircut without a problem.
Yeah, I was listening to a different podcast, not a Jewish one, where they said that once the businesses are open, they're going to see which venue gets packed first, the bars or the barbershops.
Right.
Are there other halachos that we have to be mindful of moving forward? I don't know how long this is going to be going. I don't know if there's going to be things that might impact Shavuos or Tisha B'Av. Like, are there things that we have to be concerned about moving forward?
Look, I think we'll deal with the dialet l'tzara b'sha'ata. We deal with the crises as they present themselves. This is now the end of March, beginning of April. The federal government has said the month of April will probably still be in the same situation. What will happen beyond that? We will have to see. I think that we're creating new possibilities. My wife, who's involved in the area of education, is now working with educators to talk about what does graduation look like now.
Right.
Because we have public rituals that people will not be able to participate in. What do we do about weddings that have been scheduled and have been pushed off? And how are they celebrated at a time? If a couple chooses to have a small wedding with just a minyan or without a minyan at this point, and what's the nature of the celebration that comes after that? My sense when it comes to Tisha B'Av, and I'm just raising, I don't know what the answer is going to be, but fasting could make a person vulnerable. A person who is otherwise healthy, fasting could make a person vulnerable. That's a question that we would have to deal with if, God forbid, we're still in this situation when the summer comes and we have to deal with Shiva Asar B'Tammuz and we have to deal with Tisha B'Av. What does that look like? We'll have to be creative. I think we've creatively dealt with a lot of situations until now, and we'll be able to continue doing that.
I skipped over earlier Tainas Bechorim. I'm a Bechor, so this is more of a personal question for me. Traditionally, we go to Siyum on Erev Pesach. Actually, I've done it twice where I didn't have to because I was at a bris twice in a row. That was an interesting 2 years. Okay. But this year, I know that there's a bunch of Zoom Siyumim being set up, but for those who want to be machmer, is it better to actually fast than to go to a Zoom Siyum?
No, a person, as I was saying before, a person should not fast. Okay. Certainly, this is not even a minor fast day. This is
this is less than a minor fast day.
Less than a minor fast day. It's not healthy. It's not safe. A person needs to be hydrated. A person needs to be. So I think it'll be usher to do so. But have a Siyum on Skype or on Zoom is not a problem at all, and you can be Yotzei that way. With Eliyahu Henkin, who was the gadol of America back in the 1940s, 1950s, writes that in fact, it's very, very interesting. He says there's not a minhag to fast anymore because everybody makes a siyum.
Right.
And he suggested that because of that if a person was not present at a siyum because they were traveling or couldn't get to a siyum, that they are poded, that they redeem their fast with tzedakah, and that a person should give money to charity that would equal the amount of money that they would pay for their meals, and then they would be exempt from fasting as well.
It's funny. Do you think we'll get to that point during the 9 days when people just make siyumim every day and then we abolish it?
No, I think that's there's no mitzvah to have meat. And right. People like dairy, and it's a different. I don't think so.
Okay. My last question, and then I'm going to let you have the last. If there's anything else you want to talk about, my last question is regarding leaning. The classic case is if Eretz Yisrael is ahead a parsha and somebody comes from America or from Chutz La'aretz, anywhere, to Eretz Yisrael, and they are going to be missing a parsha, they could lane an additional one, let's say mincha or sometime during the week, to make sure that they catch the whole thing. Now we're going through weeks of not having a parsha to lane. Is there a way that we're going to be making this up as a kehila, or are we just going to continue from wherever we're up to?
Right. So the basic rule, the basic halacha is that there's no obligation to make it up. If God forbid you're sick one week, you miss Shabbos, you go to shul the next week, you're not making up the parsha. But the obligation of laning in shul is a chovet hatzibur. It's an obligation on the community, not on the individual. So that's number one. Shulchan Aruch talks about situations. It was interesting to me where a fight breaks out in shul and they couldn't finish the parsha. So the following week they have to make up the parsha. So I guess there was more than talking that was going on. Things that they had to worry about. So applying that to our case, Rav Schechter spoke about this at length and has written about this at length, that in fact, the obligation to make up the parsha that second week is only when there was a tzibur, when there was a minyan present, and for some reason they weren't able to read. But if the shul is closed, there's no tzibur, there's no community, there's no minyan present, in that sense, there's no obligation. And so that's number one. Number two is to make up so many parshiot, how many weeks we have to do it, would be such a tircha d'tzibur, would be such an imposition on many people, that unless a community was mochel, unless they said, no, we want to hear the laning, and maybe there'll be special minyanim to read, 4 or 5, 10 parshiot, there's no obligation to do that. However, a community can. Rav Schechter said a community doesn't even have to read all the parshiot. They can, once they read what they are obligated to read that week, they can add other lanings as well. So this may be an interesting opportunity, for example, it depends on the shul as well. If you have a bar mitzvah boy who prepared a parsha, you could read the parsha of the week, and then from another Torah, read a parsha from 3 weeks ago, read a parsha from 5 weeks ago, or read part of that parsha. That wouldn't be a problem. The only question would be, which haftarah would you read? Would you read the haftarah of the week or the haftarah of the last kriya? And he felt, interestingly, that just as when we take out 2 Sifrei Torah, we always read the haftarah from the last reading, that if you read, I don't know, it's, let's say somebody had their bar mitzvah was kitisa, and now we're already at the end of, which is the middle of Shmot, and now we're already at the end of Vayikra, that you could read from kitisa, but then you'd have to read the haftarah from kitisa and not from the Parshat HaShavua. This is up to the local Orthodox rabbi and the rabbi of the shul to make a determination as to what is going to happen.
As we said earlier, most of what we said today, consult your local Orthodox rabbi.
Yeah, most certainly. Look, we're fielding all kinds of shilas, all kinds of religious questions, and the fact that our community is turning to halacha to look for structure and to look for ways to make their lives not just meaningful, but to give their lives structure and to deal with the anxiety and the uncertainty of the situation by falling back to Torah is really a very wonderful thing and speaks volumes of the community. So you have many questions in terms of day-to-day life and in terms of prayer. You have questions with regard to mikvah and how to deal with those questions. You have questions we've dealt with tefilat kelim. Your person buys new dishes and can't take them to the mikvah, or selling chametz when you can't shake hands on the deal. So all kinds of wonderful questions that have been asked with regard to that. And we're dealing with some very significant questions as well, real life and death questions. I got a call from the head of an ethics committee of a hospital somewhere out there in the vast beyond, looking for our position with regard to triage. A number of people are coming into the emergency room. Who do you deal with first? We know there's a big shortage of ventilators. Who gets the ventilator first? Person is on a ventilator and can't, and it looks like there's no hope for survival. Can that person be taken off the ventilator? These are important questions. Questions of the Chevra Kadisha, preparing a person properly for burial at a time when the people who are going could be endangered by viruses, because we know that the virus continues in the person's blood a number of days after they've passed away. We're putting people who are otherwise being quarantined or socially isolated at home, bring them together to perform the tahara. It's not a simple matter. What do we do about the cemetery when you can't have a minyan and you can't have the family and the friends participate in the burial the way we normally do? So there are real serious questions that our rabbis are struggling with. And again, I think there are many heroes on the front line now, people who are there to help support others and encourage others. And I'm seeing this from my niche in the RCA and dealing with rabbis who are there to help support people in pastoral ways, in emotional ways, in personal ways. There are real crises out there, family crises. Look, some of us are very fortunate to have very stable and adaptive, wonderfully adaptive families. Others have difficulties. And the shalom bayis issues that are created, tensions between husbands and wives, between parents and children, between children themselves, are exacerbated when everybody is under such anxiety and are forced to be in the same room in very close quarters that they didn't necessarily have to be otherwise. Issues of women who are victims of domestic violence is something that our rabbis are very much aware of, and we've spoken about in terms of how to offer support for them. So the issues are really significant. How to be there. You mentioned this before. When a person loses a loved one and hadn't seen them for a week because that person was hospitalized and now can't attend the funeral or can't have the proper shiva. And the halachic issues are one thing, and the emotional, personal issues are not just equally significant, but sometimes even more significant.
Wow. All right. Rabbi Dratch, thank you so much for joining us. If this persists, maybe we'll have you back on and we'll talk a little bit more about things that have come up.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time and the efforts and the wonderful work that you're doing as well.
Thank you.
Okay, it should be a healthy and a happy and a kosher Passover.
Amen. Thank you very much. My thanks to Rabbi Dratch for spending some time with us this week. Those topics that Rabbi Dratch discussed at the end, like the ethical questions that have come up, do deserve their own deep dive, but I know that these are heavier and more personal topics that I will choose to leave to remain private between those they affect and those who have to make those decisions. I'm sure other shows may delve into them, and if I hear of any, I will certainly let you know. This episode will also be our final one before Pesach, so I'd like to take this opportunity to wish all of you a Chag Kosher V'Sameach. To those of you in Chutz La'aretz, good luck with the 3-day Yontif, and until we speak again after Pesach, as always, Kol Tov.
The Jewish Living Podcast is produced by Swirly Pikus. Our theme song is The Band by A.B. Rottenberg from Journeys 4. You can email the show at jewishlivingpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Twitter at Jewish_living. The Jewish Living Podcast is recorded in conjunction with the Queen's Jewish Link.